The moment Kalen Thorne turned his back on Ilara Vance, it felt as though someone had driven a jagged shard of ice directly into his chest. He forced his stride to remain steady, his posture rigid, as he marched away from the sub-level construction zone. Every instinct in his body, every primal fiber of his ancient DNA, screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to go back to her, to pull her into his arms, to press his mouth to the pulsing, ember-lit skin of her collarbone and claim what was rightfully his. Mine. The dragon inside him roared, a soundless, seismic vibration that rattled his very bones. Mate, ours, claim her, burn the world to keep her. Kale clenched his jaw so hard he tasted the metallic tang of blood where his teeth broke the skin of his inner cheek. He focused on the pain, using it as an anchor to drag his consciousness back from the precipice of the beast. He could not claim her. He would not claim her. To claim her was to sign her death warrant. He reached the private executive elevator, swiped his keycard with a hand that trembled with suppressed violence, and stepped inside. The doors slid shut, sealing him in the mirrored box. Only when he was entirely alone did he allow the facade to crack. Kale braced his hands against the cool steel wall, bowing his head as a ragged, shuddering breath tore from his lungs. The heat in his veins was unbearable. It was a physical ache, a hollow, gnawing void right in the center of his chest where the mate bond had snapped into place, only to be violently denied. He closed his eyes, and the image of her burned behind his eyelids. Ilara Vance, sharp, brilliant, defiant Ilara. The way she had looked up at him in the dark, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and unyielding courage. She hadn't cowered. She hadn't backed down. She had challenged him, matched his intensity, and stood her ground in the dust and the dark. She was perfect. She was everything his dragon had been dreaming of for 3 centuries of exile. And she was a walking target. The elevator chimed, arriving at the penthouse level. Kale stepped out, his movements once again smoothed into the flawless, predatory grace of a billionaire CEO. He walked down the silent, carpeted hall to his private sanctuary, a suite of offices that occupied the entire top floor of the Ignis Holdings Tower. He entered his inner sanctum and locked the heavy, reinforced door behind him. With a wave of his hand and a muttered word in the ancient, guttural tongue of his homeland, the warding spells embedded in the walls flared to life. A faint, golden shimmer rippled across the floor to ceiling windows, sealing the room from all magical surveillance, scrying, and eavesdropping. Only then did Kale allow himself to collapse into the high-backed leather chair behind his massive obsidian desk. He stared at his left hand, the one that had brushed against hers. He could still feel it, the phantom heat, the electric shock of the bond. He flexed his fingers, remembering the exact texture of her skin, the fragile human warmth of her wrist beneath his grip. "The last 3 firms I hired looked at the obsidian tower and saw a trophy," she had said. "I designed fortresses that happened to be beautiful." A fortress. The irony was so bitter it made him want to laugh, or perhaps roar. He had spent a decade building Ignis Holdings into an impenetrable fortress of human wealth and influence, specifically to hide from the monsters of his past. He had chosen control over chaos, distance over desire. He had convinced himself he was safe. Fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. Kale reached into the top drawer of his desk, bypassing the sleek, modern tech, and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger. He opened it to a blank page, picking up a fountain pen. He didn't write in English. He wrote in the flowing, angular script of the Ember Peak Dragon Clan, his hand moving with frantic, desperate speed as he sketched the symbol he had seen glowing beneath the thin silk of Ilara's blouse. 3 interlocking crescents, bisected by a single, vertical flame. The cinder mark? Kale stared at the drawing, a cold dread settling into his stomach, heavier than lead. He knew that mark. Every dragon of the Ember Peak lineage knew that mark. It was the ancestral sigil of the Valerius bloodline. The Valerius clan had been the fiercest, most unyielding opponents of his father's reign, while other clans had bowed to King Malicor's tyranny or been slaughtered into submission. The Valerius had fought a guerrilla war in the mountains for decades. They were magic wielders, storm callers, and fierce protectors of the old ways. And Malicor had hunted them to the brink of extinction. Kale's father was a monster of unparalleled cruelty. When Kale's older brother, the rightful heir, had refused to order the massacre of a Valerius village, Malicor had torn him apart with his own bare hands in the throne room. Kale's mother had died of a broken heart and magical exhaustion shortly after, her life force drained by the grief. Kale had barely escaped with his own life, fleeing to the human world, severing his ties to the throne, and burying his magic beneath layers of corporate mundane. But Malicor's paranoia was endless. The king believed that a splinter group of the Valerius bloodline had survived, hiding in the human world, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Malicor's shadow assassins, the Umbra Drakes, scoured the globe, sniffing out any trace of Valerius magic. And Ilara Vance had the cinder mark. She might not even know what she was. She might believe it was a birthmark, a trick of the light, a meaningless anomaly. But to a dragon, especially to Malicor's spies, that mark was a beacon. And the mate bond? The mate bond was a megaphone. The moment a dragon fully claimed their mate, the magical resonance of the bond flared across the ether. It was a brilliant, undeniable signal. If Kale claimed Ilara, if he bit her neck and sealed their souls together, the resulting magical shockwave would light up the astral plane like a supernova. Every shadow assassin within 1,000 miles would feel it. Malicor would know exactly where she was. They would come for her. They would tear through the walls of this building, through the streets of Seattle to get to her. They would capture her, torture her, and use her as bait to draw Kale out of hiding. And when he came for her, they would kill them both. No. The dragon snarled in his mind, thrashing against the mental walls. Kale was desperately reinforcing. We protect her. We burn them all. We fight. We would lose, Kale thought back, his internal voice cold, logical, and utterly devastated. She is human. She is fragile. She has no scales, no fire, no knowledge of the war. She would be slaughtered before I could even shift. He looked at the sketch of the cinder mark again. Ilara was brilliant. She was fierce. She had looked at the raw, unfinished skeleton of his building and seen its potential. She had looked into his eyes and not flinched. She deserved a long, happy, peaceful life. She deserved to build beautiful things, to fall in love with a kind human man, to grow old in a sunlit house far away from the blood and betrayal of the dragon world. She deserved everything he could not give her. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The only way to save her life was to make her hate him. He couldn't just politely decline her services. That wouldn't be enough. If she stayed in Seattle, if she remained in his orbit, the proximity would weaken his resolve. The dragon would push harder. The bond would grow stronger. Eventually he would break. He would claim her and she would die. No. He had to sever the connection entirely. He had to make her want to leave. He had to make her despise him so thoroughly that she would pack her bags, return to whatever city she came from, and never look back. He had to become the villain in her story so she could survive to write her own happy ending. It was a monstrous thing to do to his fated mate. It felt like tearing out his own heart and crushing it beneath his heel. But it was the only play he had. Kale closed the ledger, his hand trembling. He stood up, walking to the floor-to-ceiling window. Outside, the Seattle storm was raging, lightning illuminating the churning gray clouds. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, closing his eyes as a single, agonizing tear escaped, tracing a hot path down his cheek before he ruthlessly wiped it away. "Forgive me, Ilara," he thought, the words a silent prayer to a universe that had already condemned them. "I am so sorry." He took a deep, shuddering breath. He visualized the dragon inside him, a massive roaring beast of fire and obsidian, and he began to build the walls. He packed the beast away behind layers of ice, behind decades of corporate discipline, behind the cold, unfeeling mask of Kalen Thorne, billionaire CEO. He locked the door and threw away the key. When he turned back to the room, his eyes were no longer the molten gold of a dragon. They were dark, flat, and utterly devoid of warmth. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Julian," Kale said. His voice was perfectly steady. It was the voice of a man who had just signed a death warrant, disguised as a routine business transaction. "Yes, Mr. Thorne?" Julian's voice crackled through the speaker, laced with nervous anticipation. "Cancel Ms. Vance's contract." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Sir, I don't understand. She just got here. Her preliminary review was exceptional. She identified the HVAC flaws we've been struggling with for months. She's exactly the kind of visionary you said you were looking for." "I said I was looking for resilience, Julian," Kale replied, his tone dropping to a glacial chill. "What I saw in the sub-levels was not resilience. It was arrogance. She is reckless. She disregards established safety protocols, and her vision for the core aesthetic is fundamentally flawed. She lacks the discipline this project requires. Sir, with all due respect, she's the best architect in the Pacific Northwest. If we let her go, the board will have our heads. The investors are expecting her to lead the Obsidian Tower." The board will answer to me, Kale said, his voice leaving no room for debate, and the investors will be satisfied with a project that doesn't collapse due to the ego of its lead designer, draft a termination of her lead role, offer her a remote junior consulting contract at a fraction of her asking rate. Make it insulting, Julian. Make it clear that her services are barely tolerated.
Insulting?
Julian sounded horrified. Mr. Thorne, that will humiliate her. She'll walk out of here and never work with us again. Good, Kale thought, his chest tightening with a fresh wave of agony. That is the objective, Julian, Kale said aloud, his voice perfectly flat. I want her gone. I want her to realize she is out of her depth. Do not argue with me. Draft the paperwork. I will deliver the news to her personally in the main boardroom in 10 minutes.
Yes, sir. Right away.
The intercom clicked off. Kale stood in the silence of his warded office, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical force. He could feel the dragon thrashing against the ice, furious, heartbroken, screaming at the injustice of it. She is ours. We are lying. We are hurting her. We are saving her. Kale answered silently, his mental voice hard as diamond. This is the price of her life. He walked to the mirror hanging on the wall, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit. He smoothed his tie. He looked at his reflection, searching for the man who had just condemned his soul to a lifetime of emptiness. The man looking back was a stranger. A cold, ruthless billionaire, a ghost. It was the perfect disguise. Kale turned and walked toward the door. He had a performance to give. He had to break the heart of the only woman who had ever made his dead soul feel alive, and he had to do it with a smile. He opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, the phantom heat of her skin still burning on his hand, a permanent reminder of the paradise he had just chosen to burn to the ground.